Good morning, and welcome to First Jefferson Unitarian Universalist Church. My name is David Bindi, and I am your greeter and song leader this morning. We have a guest speaker this morning. I am very eager to introduce you a little later. Our minister, Foerster, will join us also, but not for now. I invite you now to sit back and enjoy our time together. We will continue pre-recording our services until the pandemic is under control and we can really be back together again in person. In the meantime, please plan to join us on Zoom next Tuesday evening at 7 p.m. for our weekly program, Let's Talk About It. We may start talking about the ideas raised in the worship service today, but the conversation may wander wherever you wish to take it. You can look for the link in our weekly email, and if you are not on the mailing list and would like to be, you can send your request to administrator@firstjefferson.org. And now, let us begin our worship with a prelude. Call to worship this morning are words from Reverend Philip Hewitt. From the fragmented world of our everyday lives, we gather together in search of a wholeness. We would escape from bondage to the ideas of our own day and from the delusions of our own fancy. Let us labor in hope for the dawning of a new day without hatred, violence, or injustice. Let us nurture the growth in our own lives of the love that is shown in the lives of the greatest of men and women, the rays of whose lamps still illumine our way. In this spirit we gather. In this spirit we pray. Please join in singing our opening hymn, number 18, What Wondrous Love. Our chalice lighting are words from Albert Schweitzer. At times, our own light goes out and is rekindled by a spark from another person. Each of us has cause to think with deep gratitude of those who have lighted the flame without us. The next reading is by Frances Dana Gage. In 1852, Frances Dana Gage wrote a poem titled 100 Years Hence. 168 years have passed since it was written. And I'll let you decide how good her predictions were. 100 years hence. 100 years hence, what a change will be made in politics, morals, religion, and trade. In statesmen who wrangle or ride on the fence, these things will be altered 100 years hence. Our laws then will be on compulsory rules. Our prisons converted to national schools. The pleasure of sinning, 'tis all a pretense, and people will find that 100 years hence. All cheating and fraud will be laid on the shelf. Men will not get drunk, nor be bound up in self. But all lives together, good neighbors and friends, as good folks out to 100 years hence. Then woman, man's partner, man's equal shall stand, while beauty and harmony govern the land. To think for oneself will be no offense. The world will be thinking 100 years hence. Oppression and war will be heard of no more, nor blood of a slave leaves his print on our shore. Conventions will then be a useless expense, for we'll go free suffrage 100 years hence. I'm afraid Mrs. Gage might be a little bit disappointed in us as she saw where we are today. The hymn I want to share is from the same era. It was sung by those slaves that she mentioned. Number 97, Sometimes I Feel Like a Motherless Child. 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 A long way Sometimes I feel like I have no friends. Sometimes I feel like I have no friends. Sometimes I feel like I have no friends. A long way from home, a long way from home. Sometimes I feel like I'm almost gone. Sometimes I feel like I'm almost gone. Sometimes I feel like I'm almost gone. A long way from home. A long way from home. I chose that poem this morning and that song because I want to ask a favor of you. I want you now to go back in time, about 130 years back, in order to meet our guest this morning. Close your eyes while I take you there. The year is 1900. There is peace in this country. The war between the states has been over for 35 years. Slavery is no more. Women do not yet have the vote, but we who are working towards that, even now, are confident it will happen soon. For the past 60 plus of her 80 years, Mary Ashton Rice Livermore has worked diligently to right the social wrongs of this country and to bring people out of the religious dark ages and into a more gentle understanding of God as preached by the Universalist Church. You may have seen her articles in the Agitator or the Woman's Journal. You may have read her autobiography, or you may have been fortunate enough to have heard her speak before. We have asked her here today to share with us some of the struggles and highlights of her amazing life and her outlook for the future. Please join me in welcoming Mary Ashton Rice Livermore.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Bindi. And thank you for inviting me. Mr. Bindi has suggested that I speak to you of my own life, and I hesitated only enough to satisfy modesty. What can I tell you today that might be useful to you? My life has been interesting to me while I have been living it, although entirely different from what I had planned and hoped. I cannot but hope it may prove interesting to you as well. I've had little cause for complaint, although my life has been a long struggle. There's always been some good to strive for and to win, or some evil to be suppressed and rooted out. Generally, I have won that which I have sought and have most highly valued. Let's see. I am not a minister. I've never been ordained, although I have preached before and have given many lectures before august bodies such as this one. And I'm married to a Universalist minister, the Reverend Daniel Parker Livermore. It is a fact that some in the Universalist Church have complained when I spoke from the pulpit because I insist on delivering addresses that are unsectarian and ethical rather than theological. I do not stress sufficiently for some my denominational identity. And on many occasions I have taken the Universalists to task, and sometimes with severe language, for failing to enlist women in the full range of their activities. I mean, women can do more than hold tea parties to benefit Sunday schools or operate fairs to help pay ministerial salaries. Oh, they listened politely and they nodded their heads, but they failed miserably to utilize the resources of the women of the church. As for denominational matters, I do not know whether the Universalist Church is to be the church of the future or not. I do not care. I do know, just as surely as I know the sun is to rise tomorrow, that the blessed faith of the Universalist Church is to be the faith of the church of the future, whatever it is called. That I care for. In addition to speaking from the pulpit, I have given a number of lecture programs. The subjects of my lectures have included a wide range of topics. They have been biographical, historical, political, religious, reformatory, and sociological. My first lectures related to women, the great awakening of women, which is one of the phenomena of the closing 19th century. I realized that it was the young women of the country rather than those of middle age who would most largely benefit by it and who most needed stimulating and instruction. Well, I spoke out against slavery, against strong drink, and for the moral upbringing of children. As a woman, I know and understand the special struggles of women and the great gifts that they have to offer the world. Most of my early lectures were delivered before women, and the first time that I was asked to address a body of women and men, I told them, I cannot do it. The ladies of the Dubuque, Iowa AIDS Society had asked me to address about 300 women on the problems our soldiers were encountering during the war. I had spent much time in hospitals at the front and was deeply involved with the Sanitary Commission, so I was most pleased to agree to meet with them. But when I arrived and they told me that I would be addressing 3,000 of both sexes, I could not find the strength to meet their demands. It was settled that Colonel Stone, the governor-elect, would make my speech for me. We retired to a lower reception room so that I might give him all of the points which I wished to enforce, but he had another plan in mind, which was to change my mind.
Mrs. Livermore, God has given you such an opportunity to do a great work. How dare you refuse and say, I cannot do it? It is not necessary for you to deliver an oration. It is only necessary for you to say to the great audience just what you had come prepared to say to the ladies of the AIDS Society. It is for you to say whether the evening shall be a success for the hospitals of the South, whether the state of Iowa shall commence doing sanitary work, or whether this grand occasion shall prove a failure.
I gave that lecture, and as a result, we raised $8,000 in money, 500 barrels of potatoes, 88 barrels of sauerkraut, 150 bushels of onions, which are the very best anti-scorbutics, and 500 pairs of hospital shirts and drawers. I have not refused a lecture since on grounds of fear of my inadequacy, for God is with me. I seem to have rambled off the subject I had begun. Let me start again at the beginning. I have always congratulated myself that I was born in Boston. Life there was dignified and lofty in moral tone. People lived simply and without vulgar parade and ostentation. In those days, when people needed charity, it was dispensed by the churches to which they belonged, for church-going was almost universal. Those who stayed away from church habitually were regarded as outside the pale of salvation. It was part of the unwritten law of the community that everybody should be industrious, economical, courteous, and well-behaved. Children were expected to be useful to their parents. For boys, there were excellent advantages of education. For girls, almost nothing. But then it was the same everywhere. Girls could remain in school until they reached the age of 16, but if the required course of study was completed at an earlier age, or if they obtained medals for good scholarship, they were compelled to leave to make room for others. At the age of 14 and a half years, I graduated from the Hancock School and received one of the 6 medals annually awarded to girls for good scholarship and behavior. The award of a medal compelled my retirement from school. I was one of the fortunate girls, however, being able within the year to enter the female seminary at Charlestown, where I worked as an assistant pupil, teaching classes while I did my own studies at the same time. Oh, the gross injustices of this partial distribution of educational privileges was at times discussed with great heat, but the wrong was not righted until many years after. This lack of equality in education was only one of the instances of women's lot. No one who has studied history, even superficially, will for a moment dispute the statement that during the years of which we have historic account, there have brooded very steadily over the female half of the human family an air of repression, of limitation, of hindrance, of disability, of gloom, and of servitude. If there have been epochs during which women have been regarded equal to men, they have been brief and abnormal. She has been the equal of man only when punishment and the payment of taxes were in question. But women do not make one class and men another. Together they make one class, for the two are only halves of that one great whole which we call humanity. The two halves are equal, but different, complementing and supplementing the other, each designed to be the best friend and helper of the other. Oh, the hope of many today is so centered on the coming man that the only question of interest to them are those propounded in the Atlantic Monthly. Will the coming man smoke? Will he drink wine? And so on to the end of the catechism. But let it not be forgotten that before this coming man will make his appearance, his mother will precede him, and that he will be very largely what his mother will make of him. This question, as you might presume, has always had significance for me, of course, and I spoke out with equal fervor on behalf of the Negro slave. I had seen slavery firsthand in my youth, and what I saw sickened me. I could not live without speaking out against its abominations. One of my early positions had been with a family in Virginia whose 6 children I was hired to tutor. The Hendersons were social, genial, well-read, extensively traveled both in our own country and in Europe, courteous and gentle. The slaves, which I was informed were necessary for the running of the plantation, were healthy and well cared for. Mr. Henderson assured me that they were never beaten. Yet once, when I passed the Negro quarters on my return from my daily walk, I was the reluctant and inadvertent witness to the savage beating of a young Cooper's assistant. When I confronted the Hendersons with the act of their overseer, Mrs. Henderson cheered the barbarity. Mr. Henderson, somewhat less sanguinary in his attitude, still refused to reprimand the overseer for it, blaming instead the system.
Good God, I curse the fate that made me heir to these 100 of helpless blacks. I commiserate my innocent children who, in turn, are to be visited by a like calamity. To have been born a pauper would have been far less unfortunate.
But such commiseration did nothing for the young Negro, Matt by name. I took it upon myself to visit Matt alone, and peering around the cabin in all directions to satisfy myself that I was unobserved, I sat down beside the suffering man, expressing my horror at the atrocity committed, assuring him of my sympathy. He listened with wide-opened eyes, which looked searchingly into mine with almost fierce intensity. "Matt, why do you stay here?" I said. "Why don't you run away and go north as many other slaves do? There you would own yourself and your earnings, and you would be respected. I will help you. I will give you letters to people who will receive you. I will tell you how to find them. I will give you money." His eyes burned into mine. The color came to his cheek. His chest heaved, his heart beat wildly. His apathetic despair was gone, but only for a moment. Slowly his eyes closed, and turning his head wearily, he said, "Everybody that runs away from this place always gets caught and brung back. And then Massa James sells them down south. And that's hell." Matt did not run away. He never rallied from the physical and mental injury he had received. His wounds had gone too deeply. In 2 years that followed, he aged 20. He was found dead one morning on the floor of the cooper's shop, where it was evident that he had lain for some time. I returned to my New England home a pronounced abolitionist, accepting from no one any apology for slavery, for I had seen it for myself, in its mildest form to be sure, under the best administration and in the most favorable part of the South. If there its characteristics were so hideous, if it was so imbruting and cruel in its regime, violating every human instinct daily and hourly, and setting at defiance every law of Christianity, what must it have been in the more extreme South, where men were coarser and less tender in nature, and where there were almost no restrictions thrown about the master for the protection of his slaves? I became a subscriber to The Liberator, which I read with great regularity until the slaves were emancipated and the paper was discontinued. I attended every accessible anti-slavery meeting, and as a matter of conscience, always added my contribution to the funds of the society. Abraham Lincoln, a strong abolitionist, was elected president. The tensions between the pro-slavery forces of the South and the anti-slavery forces of the North continued to mount until the South could contain itself no longer. Hostilities were begun with the volcanic pouring of 50 heavy breaching guns upon Fort Sumter. All the ordinary habits of the people were immediately changed. Every city, town, and village became a recruiting station, and 10 times 75,000 volunteers could have been sent forward had they been asked. The plow was left in the furrow. The carpenter forsook his bench. The lawyer bade goodbye to his clients. The student postponed the day of his graduation, and the clerk hastened from the counting room to the tented field. Even clergymen transformed their pulpits into recruiting stations, and with the national flag festooned above and around them, preached the gospel of freedom for the black man and the duty of patriotism for all. The patriotic speech and song which fired the blood of men led them to enter the lists as soldiers, nourished by the self-sacrifices of women, and stimulated them to the collection of hospital supplies and to brave the horrors and hardships of hospital life. It is easy to understand how men catch the contagion of war, especially when they feel their quarrel to be just. One can comprehend how, fired with enthusiasm and inspired by martial music, they march to the cannon's mouth where the iron ball rains heaviest and the ranks are mowed down like grain in harvest. But for women, to send forth their husbands, their sons, their brothers and lovers to the fearful chances of the battlefield, knowing well the risks they run, this involves exquisite suffering and calls for another kind of heroism. The bravery and the sacrifice of the South, worthy of a better cause, could not preserve slavery. It was already doomed by the advancing civilization of the age. Before the North and the South fought across the continent, well, we hope that it may know no resurrection here. May we not hope that it will everywhere cease among nations of the earth. I had promised you that I would tell you something of my life to try to share with you the basis for my enthusiasms and my lifelong efforts. And in my usual fashion, I have become so heated by my causes, I have, I fear, skipped over many of the essential details of my upbringing. I will try to right that wrong immediately by taking you once more to Boston during the early part of this last century. To understand me, you must understand my family and my early training. My father accepted the Calvinistic faith in its entirety and severity as it was taught and believed 100 years before. He expounded it in his family with voluminous speech and tremendous power until I was steeped in it. Before I was 10 years old, I had the whole system at my tongue's end and could restate it and dovetail it together like a theological expert. This faith dominated my early life and has affected me more or less during all the years that have followed. We began the day with prayer and Bible reading. Every child in the family from the age of 7 was expected to read the Bible through once a year, according to a plan marked out by my father. I observed this custom until I was 23 years of age. The day was closed with prayer and Bible reading, and the children were then put through a rigorous course of self-examination concerning their use of the day, which was conducted by my father. This was not the best sleeping potion for a serious and thoughtful child like myself, And sometimes long after the whole household was steeped in slumber, I was lying awake, mourning and weeping over the events of the day in which I had participated, and which loomed up before me after the evening's investigation as heinous sins against God. As soon as we were able to walk, we were taken to church, where my father had charge of us. The Sundays of my childhood were not enjoyable days. They were observed with such unnecessary rigor. All work was tabooed on that day, even cooking, winter and summer. We rose early and were prepared for the morning Sunday school at 9 o'clock. Prayers at church were half an hour long, and the hymns contained 6 or 8 stanzas. During the sermon that followed, I gave myself up to all kinds of mental occupation to while away the time, for there was very little of the hour's discourse that I could comprehend. I imagined little stories, speculated on the lives of some of my playmates about me, and wished with all my heart and soul that God loved us more, so that we could have more happiness in this life and a better chance hereafter. I was sometimes shaken to the very center of my being, and often expressed to my father, even when very young, that I frequently felt a bitter regret that I had ever been born. There were times when I envied the cat that purred at the fireplace, or the dog that slept on the doorstep. They could be happy, for they had no souls to be saved. My dread was not alleviated some years later when I lost my beloved sister Rachel, 3 years my junior and delicate of health from birth. Happiness and I parted company forever, unless in some certain and assured manner I could be convinced that my sister was not among the lost and the damned. If she were lost, then I would follow her and share with her the eternal anathema of banishment from heaven. I was determined to acquire a sufficient knowledge of Greek to enable me to read the Bible in the language in which it was written. To this end, I succeeded in securing the services of a tutor, and when I had finished this task of months, I closed the New Testament with the firm conviction that the doctrine of endless punishment is not taught in its pages. I did not know at the time that there was a single church in which the entire congregation shared my belief. I saw myself as a heretic, and those few to whom I mentioned my doubts shared this fear and predicted my ultimate loss of salvation. I never fully recovered from the death of my beloved Rachel, but was determined to live my life full nonetheless, in spite of frequent periods of distress and depression. My early adulthood found me in the town of Duxbury, Massachusetts, where I was employed as headmistress of a private academy for both young men and young women. Never was there a pleasanter community in which to make one's home than Duxbury. It would be difficult to find a more hospitable, intelligent, social, and cultivated people in any New England town today. There were 3 churches in Duxbury at that time: the Unitarian Church, the Universalist Church, and the Methodist Church. The Unitarian congregation was the largest, the wealthiest, and the most cultivated, and stood highest on the social scale. I attended the Methodist Church, but frequently walked to the Unitarian Church, where I was always sure of hearing a finely written, practical discourse, which usually occupied an entire hour in delivery. The Universalists made a larger use of Christmas than any of the 3 parishes. On Christmas night, a joyful religious service was held in the church, which was decorated and illuminated most brilliantly. Special music services were arranged, and the sermon was devoted to some topic connected with the day and the event it was supposed to commemorate, the coming of Christ. I had never attended a Christmas service, Christmas seen as a pagan celebration in the Baptist church. On one particular Christmas day, I found myself walking the streets of Duxbury, intensely dissatisfied with life in spite of the sunshine and beauty around me. What was the meaning of life? Who could solve the great problem of human destiny? Forced into existence without our consent being asked or given, our position arbitrarily assigned us in advance, we stumble on blindly and ignorantly for a few troubled and reluctant years, and then drop out. Where? As evening deepened, so did my mood. I passed the Unitarian and the Methodist churches, lighted and filled with people, but felt no inclination to join. I neared the Universalist church, and as I passed, the door opened to admit of some visitors, and a triumphant burst of song rang out on the night air. Glory to God in the highest, on earth peace and goodwill to men. I felt drawn to enter, enthralled by the fervent, hopeful manner of the singing and prayer. The preacher was a young man, no older than I, blond in complexion, with a good voice and simple, earnest, prepossessing manner. He announced the text, "And thou shalt call his name Jesus, for he shall save his people from their sins." Save his people from their sins? He has not read that correctly, I thought. I turned to Matthew 1, 21st verse, and I read it for myself. He had read the verse aright. It was a statement that had never arrested my attention before or made upon me any impression, and there flashed through me the possibility of another gospel than what I had learned. I had read this chapter hundreds of times and was as familiar with it as with the multiplication table, but I had never used my reason to draw from it the conclusions that legitimately followed and to which I now listened. A great peace stole over me. A pulsation of love for all the world throbbed through my being. I stayed behind after the sermon and introduced myself to the young minister. I frankly avowed my interest in the sermon he had delivered, told him how entirely new it was to me, and that I'd never heard nor read anything like it before, and that I wished to know more on the views that he had advanced. Without hesitation, he placed his copy of the sermon in my hand. "Are there many people, sir, who accept the view you have advanced tonight?" I asked. And he replied, "Oh, a large number, rapidly increasing." "Do you belong to a denomination?" "Well, this is the Universalist Church," he replied, "and I'm an ordained minister of the Universalist denomination." I had heard of the Universalist denomination, but unfavorably always, as if it were outside the pale of Christian organizations. Still, I continued my questioning. I requested literature, books, papers, tracts, magazines. He offered me the services of his library, which I accepted, making an appointment to meet him the very next day. In less than a year, I became the wife of the Reverend Daniel Parker Livermore, the young Universalist minister who had become my teacher and my guide in matters of religion. To no other person am I so deeply indebted as to my husband, who has been for more than 50 years now my lover, friend, husband, housemate, and efficient helpmate. Oh my, perhaps I need to come to an ending here. You did not invite me to speak for the entire day. I would like to summarize what I have said before I leave. Slavery, the iniquitous cause of that war, is dead, never again to know a resurrection a century hence. Our children's children will justify the fearful expenditure of life and treasure, which was the cause of the excision of the hideous serfdom which had become an integral part of the Republic. While it remained, there could have been no permanent peace and no certain prosperity. For women, their long struggle for freedom, knowledge, opportunity, and the rights of human nature is nearly ended, and the day is close at hand when it shall be as good a thing to be born a boy, to be born a girl, as it is to be born a boy. As for my religion, False early conceptions of God and human destiny darkened my childhood and youth, and my later comprehension of the immanent God in whom we live and move and have our being, who we know by his indwelling presence and in whom we rest and trust as a child in its mother's arms. He has given me a noble and abiding faith in human destiny. It has slowly built up within me an unswerving trust that good shall be the final goal of ill, that not one of God's children shall become a castaway or be thrown as rubbish to the void. I am happy in a brighter outlook than I knew in my youth, happy in my pleasant home and in the society of my husband, children and grandchildren, sisters and friends, happy that I may still lend a hand to the weak and struggling or strike a blow for the right against the wrong, and happy above all that I have reached the unshaken conviction that death is but an incident in a life that will never end. These are days of hope and glory. Mr. Bindi, thank you so much for inviting me. Okay, can you say that? No, you're going to sing.
Okay, our next hymn will be We Shall Overcome, number 169, and there's 7 verses. We shall overcome, we shall overcome, we shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday. We'll walk hand in hand, we'll walk hand in hand, we'll walk hand in hand someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday. We shall all be free, we shall all be free, we shall all be free someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday. We are not afraid, we are not afraid, we are not afraid someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday. We are not alone, we are not alone, we are not alone someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday. The whole wide world around, the whole wide world around, the whole wide we shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday.
Annie Foerster here for herself. We are back in the 21st century. We are under pandemic lockdown. There are marches in the streets because of cruel acts of racial inequity and injustice. I wanted us to stop a moment and look at this from another angle, to listen to someone who has been through this and more. That was my reason for inviting Mary Livermore to speak. Frances Dana Gage's poem was not predictive, unfortunately, but we have been through this before and many wrongs have been made right. We fought a war to end slavery, and we won, but racial injustice remained, haunting us like a specter. We fought a battle to get votes for women, and we won, but equal pay eluded us. We fought a battle for civil rights, for gay rights, for environmental rights, for peace, for justice, for kindness, and for love. We keep winning, but never the entire prize. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Racial inequality does not yet exist. Gender equality does not yet exist. Clean air does not exist. We have not eradicated the diseases and the health conditions that threaten our species, but we have made inroads. History tells us it is not easy to change people's minds, but when we work together, when we talk about it, when we achieve laws, we make strides. We can't give up now. And I don't want to wait another 100 years hence. I'm tired. I'm tired of fighting, but I won't give up. Peace, justice, compassion, love, these are the principles as Unitarian Universalists we stand for. And I won't give them up. We won't give them up. We did not yet speak our covenant this morning as we usually do during a Sunday service. I wanted to save it for last so that we might remember why we can't give up. Please say it with me now. Love is the doctrine of this church. The quest of truth is our sacrament, and service is our prayer. To dwell together in peace, to seek knowledge in freedom, to serve others in community, to the end that all souls shall grow into harmony with creation, thus do we covenant with one another. I'm going to leave our chalice burning this morning as a reminder of our covenant. When you leave this program, I want you to keep it in your mind and in your heart. My benediction this morning comes from the Reverend Barbara Peskin. Because of those who came before, we are. In spite of their failings, we believe. Because of and in spite of the horizons of their vision, we too dream. Let us go remembering to praise, to live in the moment, to love mightily, to bow to the mystery. So may it be in all our lives.